As the founder of more than 400 companies, Sir Richard Branson is without question one of the most renowned entrepreneurs of our time. And, as you're probably aware, this knighted businessman is no virgin to the skies. Perhaps you may recall his attempt to circle the globe in a hot air balloon, or one of his more recent ventures, Virgin Galactic, the suborbital spaceflight company. But of course, this video is not about hot air balloons or multiplanetary travel. Rather, today's episode focuses on the remarkable story of Virgin Atlantic's historic battle with British Airways, a corporate clash which changed the course of the airline industry forever. What follows is drawn from court records, published reporting, and Branson's own accounts, shared here for educational purposes. Richard Branson did not build his empire with inherited money or quiet obedience to how things were supposed to be done. He dropped out of school at 16, struggled with dyslexia, and ran almost entirely on the capacity to see possibility where more cautious people saw unreasonable risk. His first major success, Virgin Records, gave him capital, credibility, and something considerably harder to manufacture, the habit of backing himself completely when everyone around him advised otherwise. And then, in 1978, a single cancelled flight set the rest of it in motion. Branson was 28 years old, stranded in Puerto Rico after American Airlines cancelled his evening connection to the British Virgin Islands. His future wife was waiting for him at his destination, and he was not prepared to accept that the evening was finished. So he did what great entrepreneurs instinctively do when the official system lets them down. He ignored the system entirely and built a replacement on the spot. He chartered a plane, borrowed a blackboard from airport staff, and wrote 4 words across it: Virgin Airlines. One way. $39 to BVI. Within the hour, every seat was filled by fellow stranded passengers, the cost was covered, and the flight was happening. As the plane touched down, a passenger leaned over and told him to sharpen up his service a little. With an instinct like that, he had the makings of a real airline. Branson called Boeing the following morning to ask about used 747s that might be available to lease. His team at Virgin Records thought he had finally crossed the line from ambitious into genuinely reckless. And to be fair, the airline industry gave them reasonable grounds for concern. It was a sector with more recorded bankruptcies per decade than almost any other category of business on Earth. Margins were brutally thin, competition was fierce, and the established carriers held slot rights, government relationships, and decades of operational infrastructure. But Branson was not trying to compete with the industry as it existed. He was interested in what the industry refused to be. Flying in the early 1980s was widely considered a miserable experience. Poor food, no entertainment, indifferent cabin crews, cramped seats, and ticket prices that communicated precisely how little airlines valued their passengers. Branson believed it could be different, and more importantly, he believed he was the right person to demonstrate that. He also structured his entry in a way that eliminated his downside entirely. Rather than purchasing a 747 and carrying the depreciation risk if the venture failed, he negotiated a 12-month lease with Boeing and the right to return the aircraft at year's end with no penalties attached. Maximum upside, capped downside. Every seat sold was profit without a mortgage on the back end. On June 22, 1984, Virgin Atlantic took off for the first time. Branson was 34, flying a single aircraft on a single route against an airline operating over 300 planes. Lord John King, the chairman of British Airways, responded to this development with open contempt. The quote he reached for was borrowed from a Jethro Tull album: "Too old to rock and roll, and too young to fly." It was the kind of line that ages poorly, and history has not been kind to it. Virgin did not collapse. It grew. Branson renewed his lease after year 1, added aircraft in the years following, and began attracting genuine customer enthusiasm, particularly from travelers who had grown exhausted by British Airways' institutional indifference to anyone not sitting in business class. And then came the moment that converted quiet rivalry into open war. Virgin Atlantic received permission to operate out of London's Heathrow Airport. Branson arrived to mark the occasion dressed as a pirate, which was either inspired provocation or natural celebration, probably both. For British Airways, Heathrow was not simply a profitable terminal, it was the foundation of their dominance, their monopoly over long-haul transatlantic routes from the UK, their justification for the prices they charged, their national identity as the carrier that flew Britain's flag around the world. Lord King enjoyed a working relationship with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who had publicly called him her favorite businessman. He had built British Airways into a serious commercial enterprise, and he was not going to watch a record company executive in fancy dress park his planes on the runway. He called an emergency meeting with his senior executives and issued an instruction that was simple, undisguised, and ethically indefensible. Do something about that Branson fellow. What followed was not aggressive competition. It was not a price war or a marketing offensive. It was a coordinated, covert program of corporate sabotage that would eventually be exposed and litigated in open court. The operation came to be known publicly as the Dirty Tricks Campaign. It began with access. British Airways agents used the same reservation system as Virgin Atlantic. Through that shared system, they identified Virgin passengers by name, route, and contact information. They then called those passengers directly, posing as Virgin employees, and told them their flights had been canceled. Helpfully, they offered to rebook those passengers onto British Airways instead. Hundreds of Virgin customers were quietly redirected before anyone on Branson's team understood what was happening. But Lord King's operation did not end with passenger theft. Private investigators were put on Branson personally. They followed him, they rifled through his rubbish, and then came the most dangerous tactic: rumours, placed deliberately in the press, suggesting that Virgin Atlantic was financially insolvent, paying fuel suppliers in cash because credit was no longer available, flying half-empty aircraft, and approaching collapse. In aviation, that kind of story is not bad publicity. It is an existential threat. Passengers stop booking, travel agents pull the tickets, banks start asking uncomfortable questions, suppliers demand cash terms. Virgin Atlantic had already been wounded by the redirected passengers and the fabricated cancellations. If the insolvency rumors had gone unanswered, the airline would likely not have survived the year. British Airways had helped engineer the bankruptcy of Air Europe using the same playbook just 12 months earlier. What Lord King did not account for was the character of the people he had assigned to run his campaign. Several of the agents involved broke down under the weight of what they had been ordered to do. They approached Branson directly. They told him what had happened, who had authorized it, and how far up the chain the decisions had been made. Branson now had testimony. He had witnesses. He had the shape of the entire operation. But what he did not yet have was the one thing standing between him and a courtroom victory. Stay with this, because what he had to give up next is the part of the story that most people do not reckon with fully. What Branson did not yet have was the financial power to take the most established airline in Britain into a courtroom and win. And that is the moment where this story becomes something far heavier than a corporate rivalry. Because the choice he was about to face was not simply about money or strategy, it was a choice about what he was actually willing to sacrifice to stand for something he believed in. Virgin Records was not simply a business to Richard Branson. It was the first thing he had ever built that truly worked. It was the foundation of everything that came after it: the catalog, the artists, the identity, the original proof that he could actually do this. And now, British Airways had maneuvered him into a position where he could not hold on to both it and the fight. By October of 1993, Virgin Atlantic was posting an operating loss of £9.3 million, a direct consequence of the passenger theft, the cancellation fraud, and the manufactured press stories about the airline's solvency. The dirty tricks had worked exactly as Lord King intended. They had bled the airline and stretched its reserves past the limit. Branson sat with his advisors and faced two options that were each genuinely terrible in different ways. He could sell Virgin Records, raise enough capital to fund a full legal battle, and take British Airways to court with real firepower behind him. Or he could attempt the lawsuit without that capital, risk running out of money mid-trial, and potentially lose both the airline and the label. There was no clean answer. There was no option that did not cost him something he had spent years building. He chose to fight. And in June of 1992, with tears he has described publicly and without embarrassment, Richard Branson sold Virgin Records to EMI. The price was just under $1 billion. He has since described the moment of signing as one of the most painful of his professional life, not because of the money, but because of what the label represented and what he was surrendering in order to save something equally irreplaceable. The sale gave him the resources to build a legal team capable of standing across a courtroom from British Airways lawyers without flinching. What emerged during the discovery process confirmed everything the defecting agents had already told him, and then went further. British Airways had not only run the Dirty Tricks campaign against Virgin, They had run an identical campaign against Air Europe, the competitor that had gone bankrupt the year before. That detail was more damaging than anything else in the dossier. It suggested this was not a rogue operation carried out by a handful of misguided employees. It was a deliberate, strategic pattern, authorized at the highest levels, used repeatedly against competitors who threatened British Airways' dominance. In December of 1993, the case settled out of court. Lord King and British Airways paid collective damages of nearly $1 million, plus more than £3 million in legal costs. It was the largest libel settlement in the history of British law. Branson kept none of it for himself. He divided the entire sum equally among every member of Virgin Atlantic's staff and named it, with characteristic precision, the BA Christmas bonus. British Airways was also required to issue a formal public apology. They described what had happened as regrettable incidents involving a very small number of employees in unrelated circumstances. It was the kind of apology that technically satisfies a legal requirement while containing no genuine admission of anything, which was perhaps the most British Airways response British Airways could have produced. Lord King stepped down. David Burnside, who had run the corporate communications strategy underpinning the campaign, also departed. The airline reshuffled its leadership and attempted to move forward. But a question lingers from the comments of this channel, and it is a fair one. Why did nobody face criminal charges? Lord King used corporate resources to surveil a private individual, directed agents to deceive passengers on a mass scale, deployed press rumors designed to destroy a competitor's financial standing, and operated an identical playbook that had directly contributed to another airline's bankruptcy just months earlier. The sum total of his personal accountability was a resignation from a position he had held for years. He retained his peerage. He remained on the honors list. Whether the legal system would have treated an individual without those institutional protections differently is a question the outcome does not answer cleanly. Branson rebuilt. He poured everything from the sale of Virgin Records back into Virgin Atlantic, expanded routes, and kept doing what he had always done, finding industries that were comfortable, self-satisfied, and indifferent to the people they existed to serve, and walking in with something better. What the story of Virgin Atlantic demonstrates, in a way that a decade of business school case studies cannot quite replicate, is that the most durable competitive advantages are the ones your rivals cannot simply copy. British Airways could match Virgin's prices. They could copy the routes. They could replicate the seat configurations. What they could not copy was the loyalty of passengers who felt that a company was genuinely on their side. That loyalty was why Virgin's customers were confused rather than indifferent when they received fake cancellation calls. That loyalty was why the agents running the Dirty Tricks campaign eventually broke down and went to Branson directly. That loyalty was why, even as the financial damage mounted, the Virgin brand remained something people wanted to defend. It was also worth noting, as several viewers from this community have observed, that the scale of the legal punishment was not proportionate to the documented damage. Virgin Atlantic posted losses of nearly £10 million as a direct result of the campaign. British Airways paid out approximately $4 million in total. The arithmetic of corporate accountability has its own uncomfortable logic, and this story is one of its clearest illustrations. If you believe this story deserved a courtroom drama of its own, you are not alone. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from today. This channel reaches viewers across the United States, the United Kingdom, Malaysia, India, Canada, Australia, and Singapore, and knowing where you are helps shape which stories we cover next. Subscribe so you do not miss the next episode, because the business stories worth understanding are rarely the ones already getting the most attention. Until next time, stay smart.